And finally, I'm very, very happy to introduce our first speaker, Andrew Revkin. Andrew Revkin is a prize-winning science reporter and author who has spent a quarter of a century covering subjects ranging from the troubled relationship of science and politics to climate change at the North Pole. Since 1995, he has been covering the environment for the New York Times and has written acclaimed books on the Amazon, global warming, and the changing Arctic. He has continually covered the science and politics of global warming in more than 500 magazine and newspaper stories, a prize-winning Discovery Times documentary called Arctic Rush, and on his acclaimed New York Times blog, .earth, created in October 2007. In 2008, Mr. Revkin received the John Chancellor Award, one of journalism's highest honors, for his 2 decades of pioneering coverage of global warming. His work has won most of the top honors in science journalism, including the National Academy of Sciences Communication Award and 2 awards from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In spare moments, he's a performing songwriter and multi-instrumentalist who occasionally accompanies Pete Seeger, another great of the environmental movement, at regional shows and plays in a folk blues band called Uncle Wade. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Revkin. Thanks a lot.
Great, I'm just going to get plugged in here. I'll be with Pete Seeger tomorrow afternoon, actually. I will, and his 95th birthday is coming up, May 3rd. If you're in the Hudson Valley, come to the Beacon, New York waterfront, and you can join in a big party.
Tell him we said happy birthday.
I will. He is a force of nature, force for nature. Hold on one more second. That's got to go in here. I can? Yeah. So good morning. There's like a gulf between us, but let's see. Actually, with this, I could maybe walk down there, but I'll do that for the Q&A. So as you heard, I've been writing about climate change, the human relationship to the climate system since the mid-1980s. The first stories that I did were on nuclear winter, not global warming. And oh, I see. This is the this. And do I have to turn that on? Sorry. And but it was only really since 2000, I'd say 2006, that I really started to dig in on the climate in here, the climate in our minds. It was a whole body of research that I had. That's actually too weird. Something, you know, let's stick with this other microphone.
Okay.
That's way overloaded or something. It's going to explode. And let me just get the PowerPoint up too, and then we'll be all set. The climate in our heads is actually, you know, I've been to the North Pole. I've seen the sea ice cracking under my feet. I've been to the White House, which is probably the scariest part of the climate debate, is what happens in Washington. So I've seen kind of the dark side of this, but nothing that I've seen compares. I've been on Greenland's ice sheet and watching the moulins, the water flow into these big cracks in the ice sheet, but nothing compares to the body of work that I've dug into in recent years on how we respond or don't respond to risk and opportunity. And that's led me to write, since 2006, a bunch of stories and blog posts on research on our social and our personal psychological reactions to risk messages and why we don't kind of get something like climate change. Once you see that work, it's so obvious. It's kind of such a no-brainer that it makes me realize that I'm a climate denialist, actually. For 25 years, I assumed that more information, I was in denial on the idea that more information would change the way we work on climate change. I thought, well, I'll just write more effective stories. I'll do a documentary. I'll do funky videos on YouTube. I'll try some other approaches, and that will then magically crystallize some kind of common approach to addressing this global challenge. But the more you dig in, the more you realize that we will not have a common approach. We can have a common good, a sense of the common good, but we can't assume that we'll march in lockstep toward that goal with a single mindset about what's dangerous, how dangerous is it, and how do you get there from here. And I just want to take you through sort of the dark side of that research, and then I do see plenty of opportunities to build progress, even knowing what we know about the human mind and how how normal it is. And actually, the way I used to speak about this was our inconvenient mind, with a clear echo of a pretty prominent climate documentary. But now I added the S, because we have very different minds, plural, and I'm sure there's people on this campus who study this reality that I'm talking about. And the downside is it's pretty easy to get glum. I'm sure, I don't know whether overall at this stage of the conference, are you kind of glum, despondent, excited? Let's see, we could do a poll. Who's excited? Oh, that's good, that's good, that's good. Okay, you should be. Who's totally bummed out? Yeah, okay. So you get the idea. So I was in Copenhagen at the climate talks in 2009. I took this picture on my last day as a reporter, a full-time staff reporter at the New York Times, in the newsroom at the climate talks. And this guy, this cameraman, kind of sort of captured in his body language how many people have felt, whether it was in the fight over climate legislation or over treaty, over communication, or over other aspects of this climate challenge. We've all had moments where we feel like this cameraman, just completely discharged and exhausted. And there was a moment, I think, that really crystallized some of this during the Supreme Court debate over whether CO2, carbon dioxide, merited regulation under the Clean Air Act. And I love this moment. This was, I met Justice Scalia a year ago at Rensselaer Polytechnic. He's quite a character. But anyway, James Milkey, who was representing the state of Massachusetts and was the main voice of the folks calling for CO2 regulation, had this little conversation. This is straight from the transcript, including the word laughter. So here they go. James Milkey is explaining a little technical detail about CO2 and climate in the atmosphere. Respectfully, Your Honor, it's not the stratosphere. It's the troposphere. Scalia says, troposphere, whatever. I told you before, I'm not a scientist. Laughter. That's why I don't want to have to deal with global warming, to tell you the truth. Now, if you're a progressive, liberal kind of person, you look at this and you go, oh, this is a conservative Luddite in action. But when you really dig in on that reality, we just don't want to deal with global warming, to tell you the truth. I think that's true of more than just Justice Scalia. It's true of a lot of us on many levels, because there's so much else on our plates. Real-time imperatives, real-time risks always swamp long-term realities. Even if they're powerfully understood, the long-term time frame is really tough for us. And we care about people in other parts of the world, but we really do care more about getting our kids back from school this afternoon, that kind of thing. So we all really don't want to deal with climate change, global warming to some extent. And here's what I try to do periodically, is step back from climate. We have, the whole conversation about sustainability has become very climate-centric, but we forget what a unique juncture in our species history we're at right now. That we were dribbling along right through till 1800. The human species was just kind of a dribble, and then kaboom! We had this burst of us, both in our numbers and our appetites. There's a website, populationaction.org. If you go there right now, if you have a device, you can plug in your birth date and see where you are on the curve of us. I was born in 1956. I'm getting to be old. And so I was born when there were 2.79 billion of us. And you can find out where you are on that curve. It's kind of a good reminder. And of course, that's just the curve of numbers of us. Then there's all these other curves. I mean, they all have the same shape. There's a website called The Great Acceleration. The IGBP, International Biosphere Program, has pulled together all the ways we're surging. And you look at this and you go, oh, OMG, if you're 18 or under. And it's kind of daunting. So it's not surprising that we all feel like that cameraman once in a while. When you consider this sense that we're heading toward a cliff or toward a planetary boundary, choose your terminology for the idea that there's limits to this. Most curves in nature don't go like this forever. They go like this, and then they hit some barrier, and there's a new steady state or a reaction or a rebound. And just here's this thing that really gets you. Think about as we head toward 9 billion of us, and as we head toward 9 billion of us who are less poor, which is a great trajectory on the planet. But then when you embed our norms for like what you do when you're less poor, can you imagine 9 billion people doing this in 2050? It doesn't feel sustainable. So this was a photo that a friend of mine took of one of the Times staff photographers at one of those Black Friday moment. So of course now, and see, Black Friday is now Thursday. They pushed it into Thanksgiving itself. So we have this bizarre appetite for that we don't seem to be very good at governing so far. And I've written about this periodically on .earth. I've compared us, as other people have, to bacteria smeared on agar. We're kind of like, growing, growing, growing. And what science has done, the whole planetary boundaries thing, and the first books on planetary limits in the 80s and 90s, Bill Clark's work at Harvard, National Academy's reports were saying there's an edge to the petri dish, basically. And that's what science has been saying to us for the last 50 years in one way or another. There's an edge to the petri dish. And they've been pointing it with ever louder messages. And we are still kind of just in that sort of growth spurt mode that we've all been through. I think everyone here is old enough to have gone through puberty. So you know what that feeling is like when you're in that mode of just go, 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 run, 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 don't think about the future. And basically, where we've been in puberty, if you just substitute oil and coal for testosterone, you get the idea. Fossil-fueled puberty. And now scientists, again, this is like, here's Martin Parry at the climate talks, the climate IPCC report rollout in Paris in 2007. Essentially, he's pointing to the edge of the petri dish, whether it's food, water, coastlines, health, there's an edge to the petri dish. And just to hammer home the point of our teenage reaction to that messaging as a society so far, and it's not just here, it's many other places in the world too, when you dig in. It's kind of like, it reminds me of Rebel Without a Cause. Let's see if this works. I want to make sure that the audio is working. It may not be. Well, anyway, yeah, we didn't test that ahead of time. It would be a sound person question. Oh. Well, anyway, don't worry about it. If you remember Rebel Without a Cause, if you've seen the film, James Dean's character basically says, tells his father to go shove it when his father is admonishing him after he's been arrested. I am going to need that at some point, so if you could check with the sound people toward the end of the talk. So here's some of the work I want to walk you through just briefly on. It's this. Let me see if this one works. Hold on one second while we just make sure. Yeah, it's not even crackling or something. Okay. There's a website called Culturalcognition.net. It's a bunch of work done mainly by Dan Kahane at Yale. He's a law professor, but he's a psychologist. And he studies the normal nature of the divisions in society by showing people the same. If you take what looks like a magazine article about HPV virus, a vaccine, and you show it to people, but you change the picture of the scientist who's quoted in the article, it completely changes the receptivity of the audience to the information. And so it basically, again, says information on its own doesn't really matter. If you trust the messenger or don't trust the messenger, you can kind of come away with a completely different reality. So when I was digging in on this research, I realized, well, God, this basically means if you have a stake dug-in position on global warming and you want to have a debate, right now you can go out and pick and choose a Nobel Prize winning physicist to support your position. I did a post on .earth a couple of years ago that had this framing. If you can pick Bert Richter, wow. Bert Richter cares a lot about global warming. He doesn't see renewable energy as a solution that can be scalable. Ivar Gaever from Rensselaer, 1977 Nobel Prize winner, completely freaked out when the American Physical Society a few years ago said the evidence for global warming was incontrovertible. He said that's a religious point of view. That's not science. And so he's kind of like, this whole thing is just hooey. Steve Chu, of course. And oh God, I'm blanking on his name. Another Nobel Prize winner. He's kind of in the middle. And so you can kind of so these are people who actually understand physics quite well, and they got Nobel Prizes after all, but they have different views that kind of articulate and reflect our positions in society. So that says to me, again, more information isn't going to matter. Wow, as a journalist, that's a heavy message to absorb, and that's why I said I felt like I've been in denial on the possibility that information on its own can make this argument, make people kind of figure this out better. So often I feel like we're in a world of birds. There's my friend Lynn Cherry, who's an environmental writer and filmmaker. She created this meme, a visual meme, for those people who don't get it yet. And then, of course, there's some people on the other side of this argument who feel that there's a lot of Chicken Littles out there saying the sky is falling. So we're kind of in this message battle that's mostly between those two frames, when, of course, reality is far more nuanced. And in fact, societal views are much more nuanced. They're not just in these compartments. And what I've been trying to do on .earth and in my writing generally is to kind of get beyond the caricatures and get a sense of that once you understand the lay of the land psychologically and sociologically, what can you actually do that can make a difference on issues that are going to become more important as we head toward 9 billion people seeking more stuff, et cetera. And by the way, just this morning, just last night, I saw an example of this on Twitter. If you're on, how many of you are on Twitter? That's really good. It's usually like 10% of an audience. And so on Twitter, late last night, an EPA researcher sent me this new study that shows the huge, yeah, if you can kind of, I don't know why I'm getting no signal there. There's a huge health cost to fossil fuel energy that is not accounted for in the price you pay for it. And so I posted on that. That's okay. Let me just look here. I posted on that, and Jude Clementi, who's a kind of a reasonable guy, he says, yeah, but you're not including all those the benefits of all that fossil fuels. And so again, even with economic analysis, depending on your framing or how big you make the environment, that sounded good. I heard a good. I heard a click. So from his point of view, which probably is libertarian, we haven't done the analysis right. You're including all those huge health costs, but you're not including all the uncounted benefits of having access to electricity. And that debate can go on and on and on. So don't expect some scientific analysis or economic analysis to resolve the debate. It's amazing to see. And by the way, that's one reason it's valuable to be on Twitter, because you can kind of test the views of other audiences. You're always kind of, it's like us. Twitter is just a bigger reflection of us. And so you can kind of get the feel for us that way. Now, one of the other, I'm taking you down, right? We're kind of going down, down, down. I'm going to go down one more layer, which is, of course, that our media landscape is changing in the midst of all this from what felt so good. I don't know how many of you grew up in the 20th century. I did. But you laugh, but look around. Like in the back rows there, I see people who have lived, usually when you come to a university, more than half of the people in an audience have not grown up in the 20th century. They're growing up in the 21st century. So back then we had this great system of learning about the state of the world. Someone just said, that's the way it is. In fact, you can actually hear him. For anyone who's never heard him.
This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of CBS Evening News, and that's the way it is. Friday, March 6, 1981. This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of CBS Evening News.
So, it was so easy back then. We just sort of had supper. In my household, we literally had supper with the TV, with Walter Cronkite telling us the way of the world. So we didn't have to think. We kind of we had this communal kind of comfort meal every night. All of America, 40 million, 100 million people were listening to the same news being delivered, handed to us. And now, depending on your issue, if it's climate change, you go out, and this is where you get your news. If you're a liberal, you go to 350.org or Climate Progress. If you're a conservative, you go to What's Up With That. And so now we're all still dining on comfort food, but it's the world's biggest buffet. It's like everything is there, sushi and bison meat and whatever. So you can kind of we're all becoming more compartmentalized. So this great tool, the web, which is supposed to make us unified and have a global conversation, can, if it's not dived into with purpose, can actually subdivide us even more than ever. Now, so the downside is that we're living increasingly in bubbles of our own making. Your friends on Facebook, which for a lot of people is the way they learn about what's going on in the world, they're your friends. They're people who are probably like you. And that means you have to work to kind of get outside your bubble, and you have to work now harder to assess the quality of information. I think in the long run, it's going to work out fine. In the short run, it's very dirty and noisy and clashy and calamitous, but I think we're going to be okay. but it has to be taught. One reason I moved to academia 2 years ago when I left the Times at Pace University is to come up with courses to teach kids how to thrive online. And I think that's a vital core challenge and opportunity for us in academia to do, whether you care about climate change or alleviation of poverty or healthcare, whatever. And now in the climate arena, those of us who spend a lot of our time in the climate arena, it feels like loud and big, but it's actually tiny. This is an issue that we have to kind of get comfortable with. All of this stuff, when you go to, there's a website called newsmap.jp. I recommend it. Go to newsmap.jp and you'll see that basically all of climate news, all of our climate debate is like here. And this is actually too big. I just created this as a mock-up. It's not even visible when you look at the overall flow of what people around the world are thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So we have to get real about, it feels grand and big, and it's probably one of the great stories of our time is our climate transition we're going through. But it's like that in terms of what people actually think about and care about on a day-to-day basis. And in 2008, a reader on .earth from Germany posted a comment. I love this. He said, well, are we stuck with blah, 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 bang in our approach to disasters or issues like climate change? And I repeat, I put this up periodically because I think he's asked a really good question. Are we stuck with this? Given all that stuff I just laid out, given the depth of our discounting for the long term, and our over referencing or our hyper attention to the now and the close, can we change? And I think it's possible. It's going to be a slow transition. It's not going to be a lockstep transition. We're not going to get the world or America to think the same about these issues. And getting comfortable with that, I think, is step one toward having a truly progressive approach to having some good outcomes as we go through this transition as a species. Just to give you a sense, this is probably the end of the down slope. Here are two wonderful people who care deeply about global warming. Bill McKibben on the right, I'm sure most of you know or know of, and George Monbiot on the left, who's kind of the Bill McKibben of England. After Fukushima happened, that disaster, the tsunami and the wrecked nuclear power plant, the day after it happened, each of them wrote a heartfelt essay about the implications of this disaster for nuclear power. And George Monbiot said this utter disaster proved that nuclear power is more important than ever, because here was a 9.0 earthquake and an unprecedented tsunami for the modern era, and the plant still didn't go into meltdown mode, and it didn't actually kill anyone yet, et cetera. So his approach was that he feels because of global warming, we need every non-emitting option possible. He feels this proved the case for nuclear power. And Bill McKibben wrote it in the Guardian. They're both, I wrote about them side by side on .earth because it was so interesting to see. Bill McKibben in the Guardian the same day said, this proves nuclear power is brittle and dangerous and we need to go small and local and end our need for this kind of technology. So anyone who thinks that, well, if we just get rid of those Exxon-funded denier blah-blahs, then we'll all have this happy journey toward a new energy future. I think it's time to get over that idea. Jim Hansen is another classic example. Jim Hansen, there are many people who will read and promote heavily his work on climate change. I've written about it myself since the 80s. But what gets largely ignored is the analysis he's done on nuclear power and also on the limits of renewable power. So Jim Hansen, who again has chained himself to the fence of the White House over fossil fuels, he wrote a piece that's vital reading. Just Google for Hansen and tooth fairy to find it. An essay in which he's a guy who spent $40,000 to put solar panels on his barn, et cetera. He said renewables, anyone who thinks we can have a rapid transition to a post-fossil energy system through renewables believes in the tooth fairy. So read the full Jim Hansen, and he actually had a peer-reviewed piece just now, this past week, on nuclear power, the lives that have been saved by nuclear power in substituting for fossil fuels. And again, I'm not saying that I'm not here as a champion of nuclear power. I'm here as a champion of reality-based approaches to confronting things like our carbon fixation and what we might or might not do about it. So read the full Hansen, read the full McKibben, read Monbiot, get comfortable with the diversity of opinions and recognize that even in a world of perfect climate information, in other words, if you got rid of people who have been labeled as disinformers or deniers, you're not going to necessarily have some magical transformation to a post-fossil planet. And that can sound dire and kind of depressing, or it can sound, I think it means that variety is good. Variety is the spice of life. Variety is the approach that will take us, whether we like it or not, into the future. Again, here's Jim Hansen in handcuffs. He just retired from NASA a couple of days ago, so he can be more active with his activism. Here's Susan Solomon, another prize-winning climate scientist who, she ran the IPCC 2007 science report, and when she was confronted, this talks about variety again, when she was confronted by reporters at the Paris press conference, she kind of crossed her arms. The reporters were saying, a BBC reporter was badgering her, well, you've laid out the science, now tell us how you feel about it, you as a person. And she said, that's not my job. I'm here to present the science. And it's your job to react and or respond to it. So even if within the scientific community, it's okay to have a variety of responses. There are scientists who want to be activists. That's their choice. It comes with lots of compromises. It means that they'll have a harder time defending the quality of their science. There are scientists who want to be rigorously neutral and just present the data. And they're probably missing out on the possibility of speaking in 2 sentences. Actually, a scientist is still allowed to be a citizen and a father or a mother and a voter, but you have to do it in 2 sentences. You have to have your is sentence for the science that you do, and then the ought sentence in the David Hume philosopher divide sense. The ought sentence is you as a person. So, but if you do it in 1 sentence, you can get into trouble. But there's ways to go forward. There's a variety of ways to go forward. And if you're a young person, I wrote about this kid at MIT, a teenager from Toronto, from somewhere in Canada, who he went to China with his family on a summer trip and got overwhelmed with the pollution and the traffic, and he said, I'm going to invent an electric motorcycle. And now he's at MIT, and he built one, a prototype, in his grandfather's metal shop. And that's not going to solve the world's problems. 9 billion people on electric motorcycles is not going to solve the world's problems. But his attitude was like, let's do something. That's great. And then the kids in 2005 at the climate treaty talks in Montreal who were blocking the hallways and saying, this is our climate you're meddling with, meaning the future. They have a role too, So it's like variety is okay. Not everybody's going to be an inventor. Not everybody is going to be on the front lines as an activist. And we have to get comfortable with that, I think. And too many of my friends in the environmental movement have been uncomfortable with that. It's like, and actually I've been chided many times for not for supporting natural gas development if it's done right, for not crossing off nuclear power. My wife and I disagree on nuclear power. We live 8 miles from a nuclear power plant in the Hudson Valley, and in our house we kind of disagree about that, but we love each other. So we need to kind of so I think we're lifers, so we need to kind of get comfortable with that. And then here's the good. Now we're going to end on a good note, I think. The reality is, as you all know, climate matters to people, whether it's the droughts here in the Midwest or whether it's the floods in many parts of the world or the baking heat. So climate does get our attention. Weather, certainly extremes, get our attention a lot. So that means you can engage people. Water matters hugely. Too much of it and not enough of it both matter. When it's dirty, it matters hugely. I took that picture in the Amazon when I was writing my book on Chico Mendes in 1989. But there's still plenty of places, even though there's been a lot of progress on child mortality, there are plenty of places in the world where it's normal to go into a funeral parlor and see coffins in all sizes, which means there's tons of work to be done. And it also means there's tons of opportunities out there to make the world a better place in a speedy way. These are not, hand washing. Hand washing alone can change outcomes in many places. So there's, water engages people. Energy engages people, obviously. When 600 million people in India had a blackout, they realized energy matters. But there are 400 million people in India who are not on the grid yet. They don't have any electricity. So that has to be engaged with. That image I shot in the Indian Point power plant spent fuel pool area where I went there after Fukushima to do a tour of our local nuclear power plant, and it was, it's pretty spooky and scary looking down into a pool of spent fuel. But it's something, the reality is it's there, and what do you do about it going forward is an interesting question. And it matters, all this stuff matters. And when you look behind the data, the same data from Dan Kahane and the people at Yale, the Six Americas project, which is a really valuable ongoing study of attitudes on energy and climate, when you look behind the data carefully, you realize that amid all of the climate debate, underneath the skin of the climate debate, there's a lot of energy agreement. And these, I'm going to show you 3 slides that illustrate this. This was in the run-up to the cap and trade bill fiasco, 2009. So at that time, support for cap and trade policy in the critical year leading up to that, the failure of that bill, even people under this survey, there was basically 6 bubbles of us. They range from alarmed to dismissive on climate attitudes. And even the alarmed were kind of totally in the middle on whether this was a good approach to, for climate policy. So anyone who thought that that bill had a chance of passage, who realized that even the most alarmed among us about global warming were like meh on this approach, they were missing the reality that there wasn't any real groundswell of support for that. So that's kind of depressing. But then you look at, here's support for providing rebates for purchases of solar panels and fuel-efficient vehicles. Everybody is like, maybe, at least maybe. Even the dismissives were maybe. So that says to me, wow, so why are we having this big fight over climate, when we could have had a cogent, when you could ramp up to the harder stuff by looking at these kinds of approaches first, where you have hardly any disagreement. Now, but when I show this to economists, any economists in the room? Oh, there should be. You can't have a meeting on values without an economist. Anyway, economists look at this and they say, well, everyone supports that because you're basically giving away stuff. It's a freebie. You know, it's a subsidy. And I say, well, yeah, but then what about this one? This was support for requiring mandate. You know, Tea Party people are not into mandates. For requiring 45 mile per gallon fuel efficiency across vehicle fleets, even with a $1,000 cost premium. So this is a pretty interesting question. It says even if we required higher fuel efficiency and it costs more, would you be for that? And virtually everybody still says yes, except for the pure dismissive, no way, you know, stasists. And that says to me, wow, so this isn't just about giving away money. This is about something deeper. It's probably about values. It's probably about conservation. You know, one of the underpinnings of conservative thinking, you would think, is conservation. And many people on my blog who are questioning global warming's seriousness drive Priuses. They say these kinds of things. They support energy efficiency because, of course, the oil import dependency and stuff like that. So there's lots of arguments that they will buy into that can get you climate progress without having that perpetual fight about something that's become a label, kind of like gun rights and that kind of thing. And then, of course, when you realize you have all this interest in energy advance and you have this tiny dribble of research money on basic research and development on energy, this is 50 years of American science inquiry. I've put this up on .earth year after year, kind of like, it's like that Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Anyone seen that film? Where all those people keep making the same shape. Anyway, this curve is a .earth meme. So space race happens, Sputnik happens. We go, oh my God, we got to get into space. This is what something when America gets serious about something. That's kind of the level of the seriousness. It's several tens of billions of dollars a year got us to the moon and got us into space for better or worse. And then the war on cancer and the blue band is our health spending going forward. Which again it's not clear how much of that has had a big payoff, but we clearly care about health. So it gets up to 30 or 40 billion a year by recent time, and now it's shrinking. And the green dribble is energy research. And that's all energy research. That's like how to get more fossil fuels out of the ground. That's how to build better nuclear power plants and renewables. When you look inside that green dribble, you don't see, the renewables is like this even tinier dribble. And anyone who thought that the stimulus package was going to be meaningful, that you can see it at the very end. That was the stimulus, and that's over. That's history. And you can't engage America and an energy quest with a 2-year burst of adrenaline. That's not how we shape our inquiry. That's not how we shape our priorities as a nation. So that's gone away already. And this says, we still don't care about this stuff. So, but it also, when you look at this graph another way, you realize that a 2-cent wiggle in the gasoline tax would triple that energy number. I wrote a piece about that a couple of years ago. John Holdren, the science advisor of the White House, had made this point years earlier when he was at Harvard in a paper. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. build, and Obama, I think, has dropped the ball in many ways in trying to really take that bull by the horns, and just saying all of the above doesn't really get you there. You have to kind of have a real policy. You can't just do, it has to be all of the above plus policy, and I haven't seen that yet. So finally, energy poverty does matter, and this is something that I think traditional environmental groups have negated to their detriment. This is kids sitting under streetlights in a parking lot in Guinea, in Africa, because they have no electricity in their slums at home. So the only place they can do their homework is at the airport parking lot. And I post this picture on .earth. It must be there 5 or 6 times in the last 4 years as a reminder of just how pernicious this gap, this energy gap is, because these are kids who are already engaged. They're in school. They want to achieve. They want to have jobs. They want to become a productive part of society and a place that needs productivity and change and education, and they have to go to an airport parking lot to do their homework? Give me a break. We can do better than that. And it just drives me crazy. I did a piece on .earth. A scientist at Stanford University recently went to Nepal to do a climate study on how small mammals in the Himalayas are responding to climate change. While she was there, she stumbled onto a jarring scene where there was a tea house, serves tourists trekking in the Himalayas, and there was another tea house a little far down the path. And these kids were sitting there. It was kind of, there could have been violins playing, da 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 da. It was a beautiful Nepali kind of hillside scene. And then suddenly this kid kind of gets up, goes running down the hill because another kid is coming out of the forest with a bundle of sticks that he had harvested by climbing trees, and they start to have a fight over the firewood. And then the rest of the households come out, and they end up in a knife fight over firewood, because, I mean, it's stunning. Just search for a knife fight and Nepal and .earth, and you'll find the piece. She wrote a piece for my blog about this, and it says to me, again, there are many places in this world where this is not about clean energy, it's about better energy. And, in places where kids have to spend hours climbing trees to get sticks to cook the food for tourists coming in through the Himalayas, that is not sustainable energy. And so don't tell me that they need a solar panel. Tell me they need something better than firewood, and then we can have a conversation. So it's not, having a carbon-centric approach to energy everywhere, I think, is also an area where environmental groups have fallen down. And this led to a really bizarre scene in 2010 at the climate talks. So here I am in Cancun at the climate negotiations. That's not me. That's one of the most liberal climate activists around, Brad Johnson. And this is Lord Monckton, who is the iconic climate denier, for those who like labels. Whoops, whoa, what's going on here? Oh, stop that. Sorry. Anyway, Lord Monckton, he really is like a cartoon character of the climate bad guy. And so, but what was so interesting, there's all these booths, UCS probably had one there. There's a booth for, the green this and green that. And then there's this booth where Lord Monckton is handing out little green ribbons that say, end energy poverty. And he was handing out green ribbons saying, end energy poverty, because environmental groups had sealed off that whole argument from what they were talking about. So they basically handed that issue to a coal-backed entity, CFACT, which is this Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. And that struck me so jarringly as illustrating why it was a mistake to not talk about the world's energy challenges in the full spectrum. And just to talk about carbon meant they were missing a huge constituency and a huge moral obligation, which is to bring energy to people who don't have it, who desperately need it, who are willing to get into knife fights over firewood or walk to an airport parking lot to do their homework. That is an imperative to me, as important as the climate challenge that we face, which is mainly about better light bulbs and that kind of thing. And there's there is a place for renewable energy, by the way, in those rural areas. There'll be many parts of the world, I've just been in meetings on this, where a solar panel, where you're never going to have a grid, you're never going to have a conventional power plant. So there's these wonderful things happen when you bring even a dribble of watt minutes to a place that has no electricity. A colleague of mine, Libby Rosenthal of the Times, 2009, wrote this article from rural Kenya where a woman who got tired of having to go into town to charge up her cell phone, and by the way, it's normal in many parts of the world now to have a cell phone and not have electricity yet. that's leapfrogged over access to electricity. So you have to go into town once a week to charge your cell phone, and your cell phone is your bank, remember, in Africa? It's a wonderful transformative tool. So she finally realized she could save up enough money, she could buy a little solar panel, put it on the roof of her house, charge her own cell phone. She could have lights for her kids to do homework by. And by the way, this just illustrates what's happening with cell phones. 700 million cell phones 10 years ago, basically, and they were mostly in rich countries, the blue. Now, this graph is already old. There are 6 billion cell phone subscriptions in the world now, and there are 3/4 of them are in developing countries. So that is such an exciting part of what's happening around the world, is how the access to energy is, to information is exploding, but way swamping our access to energy. So anyway, back to this woman's hut. So her kids, they don't have to walk, they're nowhere near an airport parking lot, but they can do their homework by LED light at the kitchen table. She said their grades were improving. Everything was kind of going in a good direction. And what's really cool is that she had excess watt minutes after charging her phone and her kids doing their homework. She started selling. Her neighbors were coming to her to charge their cell phones because she was able to do it cheaper than they could do it in town. And once they realized this, her neighbors started buying their own photovoltaic panels to put on their roofs. So you get this explosive, incendiary potential for progress when you bring a little bit of energy to places that have none. It's really astonishing to see how that potential can play out, which makes it a really exciting time. And that's why I wrote a piece a couple of years ago. If I had to choose a bumper sticker for my Prius, I would choose Energy Quest over Climate Crisis. This is my choice. Again, we have to have varieties of approaches going forward because it's such a rich opportunity. It's all about things we can do instead of things we can't do or shouldn't do. And I think there's enormous potential to make progress on climate through an approach to energy that has that shape to it. Now, one thing too, just again in going forward, it's important to be clear about the shape of the issue. If you go into a debate with somebody about global warming, I guarantee you that you and the person you're talking to probably have a completely different definition of that term. Global warming is amorphous. It's like, I won't bother trying to think of an analogy, but when different people think of the phrase global warming, they come up with a completely different image in their heads. So global warming really is about the greenhouse effect from greenhouse gases. And there's no real controversy about that at all. A world with more CO2 will be a warming world, period. And you probably heard from David Archer yesterday or others. There's still significant uncertainty about how much warming from a certain buildup of CO2, because there's certain real tough questions related to how you make those calculations. The CO2 itself is just an amplifier, and it builds, you have responses to a buildup of CO2 in terms of water vapor and all these other things, clouds that are durably uncertain. So I came up with this visual way of sort of dissecting the thing we call global warming into bite-sized pieces. And again, the basics are crystal clear: more CO2 warming world for centuries to come, as David Archer, I'm sure, said, millenniums to come, actually. But on a short time scale, how quickly do things warm up? On a really short time scale, there's a huge amount of variability, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Pace of sea level rise. When I wrote about global warming in 1988, my big first article in Discover magazine, everyone was talking about could be a 3-foot sea level rise in the 21st century, more or less, and everyone is still basically saying the same thing now. I just did an online chat with a bunch of people at NASA last week. If you Google, we did a Google Hangout, me and a bunch of NASA scientists on sea level. And I made the point that, so basically you're saying that now, after 25 years of really focused science, we still don't know enough about ice sheets, particularly to know with some kind of certainty how much sea level rise could occur by 2100, which is really, on our time scales, the only thing that matters. We do know, again, as David Archer would tell you, that we're going to see millenniums of sea level rise. But we don't know the pace and the time that matters to us societally in the next 100 years very well at all. So getting real about that is important, and that has important implications. How much do you invest in decarbonization? How much do you invest in girding shorelines against storm surge? That's a no-brainer, because you know that we're facing retreating coastlines basically here on in. But again, so this is, I use this as like a curve. You know, the curve of our understanding of CO2 as a greenhouse gas is really steep. It's got not much tail at all. The curve on these issues is really shallow, and it's not manufactured uncertainty. This is real uncertainty. Regional climate forecasts, forget about it. So talk to Gavin Schmidt at NASA, who probably is going to take Jim Hansen's position. You know, he'll say you could give us billions of dollars and better supercomputers year after year, and we're not going to be able to tell you much better the sort of 10 to 20 year climate forecast for Chicago. It's just not going to happen because of the basic limits of our understanding of the climate system. So, and actually I've said to scientists sometimes, maybe they need to do a better job of telling us the things that they can't answer for us. You know, scientists often just want to keep doing their science, which is normal. But I think there could be a better messaging from science on the things that they're not going to get, that 5 more years of work isn't going to help clarify society's decisions on. Extreme events in a warming climate, again, the nature of extreme events is that they're rare. There have been epic deluges in the Northeast that going back in time through paleo climate records, you can see this stuff that 1821, New York got hammered by a mega hurricane in a way that swamped a far greater area of lower Manhattan than happened with Sandy. So these things happen. How much, the things that we know clearly are, you know, rising seas means that any storm will have a bigger storm surge impact. So that's like a no-brainer. But getting into an argument about Sandy being the incarnation of global warming can be dangerous depending on how you discuss it. So there was this great piece in Nature, in the news part of Nature a couple of years ago, basically said, do we need to go to risk school? Because we're really bad at, you know, along with all those other aspects of our brains that make it hard for us to absorb things like global warming and respond to it, we have a real innumeracy when it comes to understanding risk and understanding things like the difference between stocks and flows. The greenhouse problem, you know, you have a cumulative gas, and you can't just sort of stop the growth in emissions and solve the problem. You have to cut them deeply. John Sturman at MIT did a really effective study where he canvassed something like a couple hundred people at MIT, very smart people obviously then, and gave them a simple little quiz on climate change. They gave them a brief primer on the nature of the problem, you know, durable gas. To stabilize concentration in the atmosphere, you'd have to stop the emissions, and then they had them draw curves. So draw a curve for emissions that you would see solving the problem, and 2/3 of the people got it wrong. That the curve has to go to 0, essentially, to stop the problem. But even MIT wizards, 2/3 of them got it wrong. So I do think we need to figure out better ways to teach from a very early age some of these concepts about statistics, about uncertainty being a form of knowledge. You know, when scientists delineate uncertainty, that's knowledge. And instead of being the opposite, which is, you think of uncertainty mostly in our typical jargon, it's the lack of knowledge, but it's not if it's delineated by science. And there's so many ways to do that. Here's one example. Well, actually, before I get to the example, I want to tell you there's huge potential here for young communicators to dive in and help people develop the tools that can foster that kind of learning. I was at the AAAS meeting a couple of years ago, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and there was a session on what science teachers need, meaning elementary and high school science teachers. And one of the things they crave is having little short explanatory videos to just sort of lay out the basics, like a 1-minute thing. They don't need Nova epics on the changing planet. They need 1-minute explainers. And so I did this post a couple of years ago on this. And there's wonderful stuff burbling out there. There's a Danish TV station that produced one example that I think makes the point.
A common mistake in interpreting statistics is to look at them from too short a distance. This can make everything unclear and confusing. So forget the details and take a step back. You're looking at a dog when you should be concentrating on the owner. As you can see, the dog is all over the place, leaping and bouncing, sometimes upwards, sometimes downwards. But where do you think it'll be in 10 seconds' time? Around here, right? But at this moment, the dog is on its way downwards, so why do you think it'll find itself up there? It's because you've noticed the owner. The owner is the trend, and it's he who determines where they both will be in a while as a bit longer than a couple of dog pounds. He could change direction. There's a lot we don't know about this guy. But everything we do know indicates he's heading in that direction. The owner is the long-term trend. The dog is the variation around this trend. Or the owner is the climate, the dog is the weather.
So that's pretty cool, huh? Teddy T, you can look for that online. And there's, you know, why aren't we doing more of that stuff? And you can have it reviewed by scientists for accuracy. My students at Pace in my communication courses, you know, my son at Pace, who's a junior at Pace, did an animation of a way to build a building more robustly in an earthquake zone, but using the same materials. So like in Pakistan, you could if you just shift the way the materials are configured in a school, an engineer had done this design. My son did kind of a clever, funky animation of it that I put on .earth. And he did it in a couple of hours. And so if we just put together these skill sets better, if we build a kind of a match.com for scientific knowledge and communication knowledge, we can have much better outcomes than we're having right now. And you can do it on a budget. You know, this is stuff, once it's out there, a teacher in a struggling school system, if there's a capacity to find it, can then employ it, and you can get kids creating their own versions of it, because kids are so literate with these tools now. We're only scratching the potential of what's possible. There's another interesting group that's been working, that did some work along these lines that's not active now. AtlanticRising.com was this project put together by 3 or 4 British educators, environmental educators. They went around the Atlantic Ocean, from Ghana to Scotland to Nantucket to a number of other communities, and held these workshops on sea level rise, where they had kids down on the beach. They got surveying equipment and try to understand what 3 feet of sea level rise would mean for your community. And then they kind of linked these schools together. In Ghana, students in Ghana and Scotland were Skyping with each other to kind of compare notes. So you have coastal communities sharing insights and information and reactions to insights about sea level rise in ways that I think are incredibly valuable, because and you can do that, you know, in Great Plains communities. You can do that there's areas out in the Midwest that have similar regions in Europe and in East Asia. You can kind of start to build a conversation from an early age about this stuff to normalize the importance of climate resilience going forward. And then you can sort of work eventually toward the goal of mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions as well. But I think this is a good starting place. I call this the noosphere. It derives from noosphere, which is a term from Teilhard de Chardin and Vladimir Vernadsky from the early 20th century. We're building a global intelligence network, and these tools of the internet are allowing us to do that in a beautiful way. But as I said earlier, it has to be intentional. You have to dive into that with motivation, or it'll just be noise. And another thing that I think is a great opportunity is to step outside the nerd loop, which is a phrase that Randy Olson, a wonderful science communicator and friend of mine, talked about, and I quoted him on .earth a couple of years ago. And the nerd loop is putting out a press release when you have a paper and thinking that you're done. The nerd loop is when we just talk to each other about what to talk about instead of experimenting actively with the public in terms of how to talk about climate change and that kind of thing. And then experimenting with new models. Remember, journalism is shrinking. I took a buyout at the New York Times at the end of 2009. I still write there on the contract. But there's been more buyouts. The paper is shrinking steadily. You can't assume that the journalists, like the Walter Cronkite model, are just going to be there to tell your story going forward. This was a case several years ago where Andy Bunn, who's a paleoclimate scientist at Western Washington University, was going to Siberia to study paleoclimate trends there, looking at mud and rivers and stuff. And he said, you should come. It's going to be a great thing. Our students will be there. And I'm like, I can't go to Siberia. Besides, there's a bunch of horrible insects there. You can see what looks like dust on the negative. Remember, this is a digital image, so there's no dust on the negative. That's all mosquitoes and biting flies. So he can go, and then I said, you go and you send me images and send me some audio narration stuff, and I'll build a piece on .earth. And I called it a postcard, and it's kind of like a post-journalism approach to communicating science in the field, where he was providing information, I was curating it and assembling it. So we had a partnership that isn't conventional journalism and is not a press release by any means, but I think having a creative approach to communication going forward is essential. Richard Alley at Penn State is like the ultimate unchained communicator. You know, he dances. Has anyone seen his Milankovitch cycle dance, where his bald spot is the North Pole and his nose is the equator? And he talks about procession, and it's like he's davening. It's pretty cool. And then he sings. He does these songs about fossil fuels and stuff. Now, of course, he has tenure and prizes and stuff, so it's easier for him to be a goofy scientist communicator than it would be for a lot of other people. But you get the idea. There's a range of approaches. And I think being gutsy and trying stuff and admitting that it's an experiment, saying from the get-go, we're experimenting here, then you kind of discharge any of the tension about worrying about failure. And then, you know, just again, as I said, I'm going to hammer one more time the potential to show instead of tell. I can tell you the volume of the atmosphere at sea level pressure. It's a certain number of millions of cubic kilometers, or I can show you. And Adam Neiman, who is a science illustrator in England, came up with this approach where if you put all the air in the atmosphere at sea level pressure, that's the volume. It's not a controversial question. It's just that is the volume. And I think if you're going to start a global conversation about global commons like the atmosphere, you start with something like this. You have a better sense of engagement with the question. How do 9 billion people share that is an interesting question. It's a way to engage. And again, thinking about pedagogy, going down the chain toward an elementary or high school textbook on global change, you know, having images like this, I think is a good. It's a non-judgmental, you know, you can't look at this and say, oh, that's some liberal person trying to bend my son's mind. It's just, it's a fact. So I think there's great potential there as well. Making the invisible visible, you know, again, technology is our friend. This is, I just want to show you this again. This is the same image in visible light. It's in Colorado, it's an oil tank, and then that's with infrared camera. Infrared camera shows you that that tank is leaking methane and other compounds that are opaque when you look at them in infrared. So can you imagine if people driving down the highway in Colorado saw this? If we had this as our vision of the leakage of methane from natural gas and oil facilities, you would have much more, I think, of a campaign, much more imperative in Washington to hasten the regulation and other steps that can be taken to tighten our natural gas and oil system to not be contributing to global warming, but instead helping to mitigate it. So that says something. And there's never been a greater opportunity for DIY, for do-it-yourself stuff. There's a young guy, he's 27, he lives in Pennsylvania. He worked for the Pennsylvania House Committee on Energy, but he did this on his free time. There's all this publicly available data on the fracking that's underway in Pennsylvania, but it wasn't easily accessible, so he created a website called Fractrack.org. He said it took him like a day to just, I don't know how to do this. Someone here probably knows how to do this. Take this big body of data, throw it into a geotag system, and have it come out like this. And so now if you're moving to northeastern Pennsylvania, or if you live down the road from a well and you want to find out what's going on, you click on one of those bubbles and you have all the information that's publicly available. Who has the permit, whether there's been any violations, blah, blah, blah. And he's building other layers into this so communities can report in if they see a violation. So there's, you know, all this, oh, we can't regulate this. Of course we can't regulate it, but we can have oversight, and we've never had greater potential for transparency and for communities to take a role in managing their resources directly, at least to make the information available. It's great, so it's very exciting. And then finally, I just want to close with one of the most helpful things I see is that the reality that innovation, we always think of innovation as a better photovoltaic panel or a better battery or something. Innovation can be a social or financial thing as well. There's a young guy who I'm very impressed with. His name is Billy Parrish. He's crouching there with bare feet. And this was him in 2005. I met him at the climate talks in Montreal, that treaty talks, the interminable process. And back then, he was one of the people sitting in the hallways doing what he thought at the time was the most valuable thing, protesting as a young person in a sea of gray suits and gray hair. And now he wears a black suit. This is Billy this year. He has innovated with some other people a new way for people to invest in solar energy. And actually, I just threw $400 in to see how it works. They created a pool of money where their projects, like a housing development in Oakland, California, for low-income people, wants to put a solar panel on the roof. They don't have the capital up front to do that, but they take a loan essentially from Solar Mosaic, his entity, and the loan is, the funds come from people like you or me or more well-heeled investors, and then you get a return on your investment. It's not, the subsidy for solar in California is to some extent facilitating this, but I could see this going forward in an unsubsidized world as well. So what I love about Billy is he's innovated his own life. He's constantly pressing toward a goal, which is a post-fossil energy future, and he tried one thing, and he kind of adapted his way toward a new thing, and this may be the breakthrough, or it may not, but it's his intentionality that's very exciting, and his ability to sort of reinvent himself and keep in mind the broader goal and always look for new opportunities going forward, and I kind of love that. And that's why I'm still excited every day and not bummed out every day. So here we are. That's that amazing picture of Earth through one of the rings of Saturn, taken by one of the Voyager spacecraft leaving, and that Carl Sagan made famous, and here I am. So I'm very happy to entertain questions if there are some, and I thank you for listening. Any questions? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for your talk. I really appreciated the science communication part in particular. I wanted to, though, challenge you a little bit more on your rank order of priorities. So where you told us that you would sort of, if you had to choose a bumper sticker, you would choose fighting energy poverty over, I forget what the rival bumper sticker was. And I guess for me...
Well, actually, just to clarify, the energy quest is both. It's decarbonizing our energy and facilitating access to energy in poor places. But anyway.
Okay. I mean, and maybe that helps a little bit where I was going with it, because I guess when I conceive of poverty, energy poverty is just a small component of huger poverty problems that are getting exacerbated by climate change, drought, the food supply, where the climate potential for huge amounts of climate refugees, and so on. And so to me, I guess I couldn't conceive of choosing. I understand that you have these anecdotes about the kids who need light, but of all the things that more kids need in the impoverished world, it's probably solving their water and their food problems and disease. I mean, with the expansion of invasives and disease-carrying insects and things like that, so that, I mean, it is important which one you rank order, right? I mean, there's room to try to tackle them both, but at root, we've got to solve the climate problem.
Yeah, but here's the issue. There's a temporal discontinuity. The third world, the developing world, whatever you want to call it, is going through its great pulse of growth and persistent poverty right now through about 2050, maybe 2030. But there was a recent calculation that by 2030, there'll still be 1 billion people in the world without access to any energy, any kind of modern energy. 1 billion people. And so that's, in our time, right now, a challenge that is degrading lives in ways that are addressable now. Even if you got perfect with the global energy sort of carbon policy, it wouldn't matter to any of those people by 2050, because you look at the climate commitment trajectories. Climate change is underway, and it's going to be underway for decades. Even if Al Gore became world president and somehow had the power to change energy norms, which is, of course, not going to happen, because remember, the vast majority of growth in emissions is coming in China and India. So we are not going to change their energy norms. So those trajectories are underway. And it's absolutely important to get serious about working on that. But the imperative right now for those 1 billion or 2 people, to me, is so real. And actually, think about this. Virtually everything you mentioned is addressable with energy. Water, food. If you have better access to energy, I'll give you an example. In Mali, what's her name? Pam Matson, I think, at Stanford. They're working with a solar hydroponic system to sort of a little self-contained system, because it only works in the daytime. You only need the water in the daytime to water fields. So you just install that system, and women's co-ops, farming co-ops right now in that area are thriving because they're able to have access to energy. But there are other places, like again in the Himalayas. I don't give a hoot whether I want to have a more efficient wood burning stove for those families, or I want to have, whether it's propane or briquettes, I don't care. If it's charcoal, that's better than firewood. So they need something now. And those kids, if they get into school, they could become energy innovators. So they can help fast forward the world toward a better outcome. So I just think it has to be, it's equal. To me, it's absolutely equal, imperative. Just because of the temporal, the curves are just disconnected. So anyway.
John, introduce yourself too.
Is this on?
The switch.
Thank you. John Sitter from the English department here and part of our sustainability initiative. This is was a small part of your talk, which thank you very much for. So I'll keep it brief, but I think it's important. 4 or 5 times you spoke of the population growing to 9 billion, and that's repeated all the time. It's actually a UN middle estimate. It could be worse, but there are a lot of people who think it could and should be better, that it's really crucial to try to work
Absolutely.
to stabilize population at 8 billion, and that's feasible and urgent. So I just wanted to put a word in for not simply regarding the 9 billion
I couldn't agree more.
as a fact of nature.
Well, the other thing, I do, in another talk I do that's a little more focused on adaptation, resilience, I talk about the thing that people forget is population growth in places like sub-Saharan Africa is a far bigger driver of human vulnerability to climate extremes than global warming is. In other words, in Nigeria, well, let's take a drier country. In Mali, the fertility rates are still like 5, 6 kids per family.
Right.
If you double the population, so 2x people in that area by 2040, you're essentially doubling exposure to climate hazard. And with what we know and don't know about climate change, meaning the greenhouse influence on climate patterns in Africa, we actually don't know how big that effect is going to be by that time. So the biggest driver of human vulnerability to climate extremes in Africa, in those regions, is population growth. But that gets negated, that doesn't get considered on that, and we still think population mainly as emissions, a contributor to emissions. We're not thinking about how it contributes to vulnerability.
Yes.
So I couldn't agree more, and I've written stuff on that, but you're right. That'd be the full day talk. You don't want that.
Thank you.
Dave Hagen, Sociology and Network Science. Just really quick, kind of follows up on that. I mean, the first slides were all about these, that we were growing by leaps and bounds in a lot of different things, not just population. I got to stay in front of the mic. Not just population, but lots of other stuff. And then I like the rest of your talk about the diversity and many different ways to get at things. But what happens when we hit that hard ceiling, and how do people become aware of the problems of growth, per se, growth in population, growth in consumption? They were part of your first slides, but this doesn't come in at the end of the talk as much as our awareness of the growth problems.
Well, there's been the idea that there are hard limits butts up against the reality that in most cases with resources, I'm just setting aside the greenhouse question for now. All the other curves, like for phosphorus or copper or whatever, we innovate our way around those things. We either find a way to move off of something that becomes rare and costly, or get it out of the ground more efficiently, or there's workarounds that happen all the time, and you've seen that. That's what happened with Paul Ehrlich's projections, why they failed, because most of the cases there's a workaround, or the price goes up and we work harder to find more of it, the thing. This happened with phosphorus just last year. Phosphorus looked like one of these hard limits, and then Morocco just redid their, the USGS just did its reanalysis of Morocco's phosphate rock reserves, and it's like another 100 years at current rates. And then fracking, of course, is the classic example where something gets, where people need something, which is when the gas price got high enough. Innovators jumped in and said, hey, look, all this stuff that we thought was inaccessible is now accessible. And of course, that's led to a whole series of questions about fracking. But now you're starting to see, and I've been writing about the innovations toward cleaning up fracking, water-free fracking, all those the ways to cut the leaks, et cetera. So we have this progressive potential to migrate around or past these, what seem like hard thresholds. Now, climate, again, greenhouse buildup is the perfect problem in the sense, as I'm sure David Archer again explained, the cumulative nature of greenhouse gases and so many other aspects of it make it a tougher go. But again, there too, hard ceiling, not so clear because we're going to move our cities. Klaus, what's his name? Klaus Jacob at Columbia University has been talking recently in talks I've had with him about what New York City's downtown area would look like in 100 years. Anyone been to the city recently and seen the High Line? There's this old park. There's a park that was built on this sort of elevated rail bed. He says in Lower Manhattan, essentially, that will be the way we'll get from building to building, and it'll be a park-like landscape underneath. Like Wall Street will be more park-like, and there'll be a raised area around it, and the buildings, the towers will still be there, at least whatever replaces our towers of today by 2100. So we're going to and the people born 2050 and beyond won't have the same wistful sense of loss that we see going forward because of what's called shifting baselines of perception of the world. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying it's kind of the reality. So the idea, they'll have a different sense of those thresholds. So I kind of don't see the merits, even though I've written about them, of planetary boundaries.
Ani Abrahamian from the physics department. I really appreciated your nod about the lack of carbon dioxide emissions from nuclear energy. But I wondered if you had similar communications analysis that you had on the other climate issues with respect to, is it time that we can start a discussion on the nuclear side? I mean, clearly, present nuclear technologies, at least in the US, are not what you want to do.
Sure.
What are your guesses on the evaluation of what's going on? When is the time to start that discussion?
Well, it's happening. It's happening in China. They had a brief hiatus in their nuclear projects after Fukushima, but they're back at it. That was really perfunctory. They're back at it in a big way. So the next generation of nuclear technologies is going to get developed. It's a question of whether it'll be here or not is the other question.
I specifically wanted to know what your assessment of the U.S. situation is, because our reactors are old-fashioned ones, and we don't
I know.
have
Well, one of the question where I live is, do you relicense the aging reactor that you know is not a good design and is in a place that probably never should have had one, or do you turn it off now, or do you keep it going as long as possible? When you look at New York's energy options, turning it off instead of running it as responsibly as possible and using dry cask storage and stuff seems like a bad idea to me. But again, to my wife, it's different. So we're kind of deadlocked here, and a big chunk of the environmental movement. The big green groups don't have the potential to talk about this in a constructive way because their membership all grew up with 3 Mile Island, and they literally won't. I see it over and over again. There's an inability to sort of cross certain thresholds on that technology, on that question. And there are huge. It's mostly economic issues. It's really costly. The upfront capital kills these projects over and over. The chance that it could become a wedge scale, a kind of a big player globally in time to be meaningful to the climate debate is still a question. It's probably highly unlikely. Yeah.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering if you could comment on this. You started your talk saying that you had the idea of telling the facts and telling the stories, and you had this wonderful .earth in the New York Times, which was really doing that for many years. But then you also said that it was a little bit wishful thinking, that you hope those facts would change the minds of the people, and that's why, and then you changed to academia, and you focused on the next generation. Is that saying that the most pragmatic way to change how we face climate change is to focus on education?
To focus on what?
Education, on the next generation, because it kind of implies that it's too late for the current decision makers.
Well, it's the urgency question is what this all comes down to over and over again. If you say it's just a function of education, then you're obviating, then you're neglecting what we can and should do now, in terms of pressing for stronger policies. And of course, it's kind of an all of the above answer. It's a murky answer in the sense that clearly looking for ways to drive sensible, climate-smart energy policy in the United States should be an imperative. And this is where I think Obama has he still sticks with this rhetoric that I think is more divisive than it needs to be. You can do, Steve Schneider, fantastic climate analyst who's dead now, but at Stanford, who I grew up essentially, consulting for decades, he said we need to sequence from the things that are no-brainers now, demonstration projects, building community awareness of new power plant designs, and then working toward the harder things, which are like a tax on carbon or regulations, which we can do as well now because the Supreme Court has said that's doable. But it's to do that at the pace of doing that and the extent is still modulated by politics. So I think there's more sequencing that could be done if we had a more sustained conversation about the energy quest, including these other factors, making sure that climate wisdom is part of it, instead of having this kind of divisive fight over climate policy, meaning climate emissions policy, then I think we'd have a better outcome in the long run. And then of course the other reality is climate adaptation, whether you want to call it adaptation or resilience, is a no-brainer. If you live anywhere where you have extremes, and you can endlessly have the attribution fight over, well, how much of that hurricane was our fault? The fact that we're over vulnerable to climate hazards now is crystal clear, and finding ways to get that hazard level, exposure level down, whether it's population policy in Africa or whether it's wildfire development policy in Colorado. Like, just to give you a quick, I don't know if we're running over time, but that wildfire, the red zones in the west, in the Rockies, areas that the Forest Service has designated as inflammable and dangerous, have seen a quadrupling of development in the last 40 years. So same deal, tell me, have your fight about how much of that is global warming, but tell me, why are we still subsidizing homeowners building in places that we know are going to burn? That's like the imperative right now. So, and I think then you can build a broader conversation.
Prashant is going to ask a
quick question.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed your talk. The question I had is, you didn't touch, is the NIMBY effect. Everyone who is proponent of coal and nuclear, they always say build somewhere else.
Yes.
For example, in Indiana, we have not built any coal plants in the new sites. The nuclear, again, the 2-1 they gave in Georgia in the existing site. So this is another parity we face. And it would be nice to have one of your charts showing strongly oppose versus strongly agree, where they want to be.
Well, this gets, I want to bring what you said to the renewables fights. As I quoted someone a couple of years ago in .earth who said, if you love wind power, you better at least like transmission lines. and that gets at the reality that if you build out renewables at any scale remotely meaningful to the climate problem, you're going to have all these fights in spades, because you'll have the same questions arise over, like the solar thermal plants in the desert and the development that comes with wind power. Remember the film. The feature film that recently came out about fracking. The Promised Land, right. The original script for that was about wind developers. If you read up on that, it's really fascinating. It was going to be about rapacious wind power developers in upstate New York. And then they shifted to fracking as the sort of tide of public interest shifted. So you're right, it's a big issue.
All right, very quickly, let me say that we're going to have a short coffee break, and we're going to come back we're going to start at 10:45 as per the schedule. But of course, I think we need to thank Andy Revkin one more time for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all.